Hey, how you doing? Hey, have you heard of Christopher Nolan? Well, he's kinda one of the most popular filmmakers working today. I've been familiar with his movies for quite some time and have considered a couple of them to be all-time favorites, but I've never held any of these besides like 4 of them as some of the best movies out there. I just think his stuff is really entertaining, and it's great that he uses a mainstream template to tell art house-like complicated stories. It's made him very successful, and it's made critics and audiences get along a little better because there aren't many people out there that like despise his movies. With all that said, I do think he's a little overrated. Don't get me wrong, he's still one of my favorite filmmakers, even if I do like a lot of other filmmakers over him. I just think people take his work a little too seriously sometimes, and they probably shouldn't. Also, his fan base is kinda toxic. I like him as a filmmaker, even if it's easy to make fun of his larger-than-life style and overly serious tone that he brings with his films. I like all of his movies, even if some of them are just really dumb fun. So today I want to rank all of his movies from my least favorite to my most favorite. I'm actually not sure how to say that. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Yeah, this is Nolan's first feature film, and it's my least favorite, and it's probably his worst movie. I want to acknowledge that this movie was made for only $6,000, so this guy didn't have a lot of tools in his reach to improve certain scenes. I appreciate Nolan's approach to the story and always making sure that it was clearly his vision the entire time. When I watch this, I think of Nolan behind that camera. This is clearly his creation, and I like how he never let it blend into the background with other short, edgy crime noir films from amateur filmmakers. Like I said, this bad boy is short and sharp and makes it a little less irritating than it already is. Why is it irritating, you may ask? Well, I just think it's a little too ambitious and it doesn't exactly work out all the time. It shows that Nolan really wanted to make crime movies for adults. That's well established with this one. Side note, have you ever noticed that his first 3 films are all rated R and all part of the same exact genre? This movie feels the most like it's trying to be really adult and mature, and it doesn't really work out entirely. I appreciate seeing a Nolan movie where it doesn't depend on spectacle and big set pieces. It's a low-budget, hour-long crime movie that never really overstays its welcome, but also never has that hook to make me think, oh wow, I really care about the movie. I don't know, it was never really welcome in the first place, I guess. It's not a strong invitation, and it feels more like an experiment that came together well enough to be put into a theater, but not enough to make the whole experience feel complete. It jumps right into it without any subtlety or likability. Like I said, I understand the constraints this guy had when making this, but it just doesn't feel complete to me. This would have been better if Nolan tried to chill out a little bit and make it a little less ambitious. I almost never say that with films, so that's saying a lot coming from me. All in all, this is a movie I don't have much to say about, besides this was Christopher Nolan trying to experiment and create his own distinct style that he would later perfect. His next movie was Memento, and I think that's exactly what Following would have been if Nolan had a bigger budget and more time, so I appreciate this one for simply showing promise from this young filmmaker who would eventually become one of the biggest names in Hollywood to date. I feel like we don't talk enough about how insane The Dark Knight Rises is. I really wanted to love The Dark Knight Rises. It seemed like a great cinematic epic that was going to end the trilogy off with a bang. That's not exactly what I got. It's very clear from the beginning that Nolan didn't really want to make this film. It's obvious because there's barely any thought put into this screenplay. There's way too much going on and way too many characters being introduced. What I did love about The Dark Knight was that most of the new characters introduced for the first time, like Harvey Dent and the Joker, were really integral to the plot and naturally weave their way into this universe. The rest of the characters are just people we're already familiar with, like Alfred, Rachel, Fox, Gary Oldman. The new characters introduced in this movie are trying so hard to have a purpose to exist, but Nolan never really finds a reason for them to be there. I mean, you get Bane, who's like a cool villain, I guess. Catwoman, who's just kind of there. Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who's literally pointless. And then there's Miss Hot Lady from Inception, who I don't know the name of, but I don't know why she's in this movie. I just want to ask, who is she? Why is she here? Nobody gave me a clear answer. The only time characters are really developed is through heavy exposition that brings the film to a grinding halt. This movie feels so unfocused and does not know what it wants to be. There are so many inconsistencies and coincidences that just don't work at all. Like, for example, there's one scene where Catwoman gets on the little bat bike thingy and rides out into the night, and you think it's gonna start start some big action sequence or, I don't know, a cool scene where she's riding off into the night, but no, it just cuts to daytime. When a character dies, it cuts back and forth between the victim and the characters listening to their final words, and after each cut, another important character just magically shows up. Anne Hathaway randomly makes out with Christian Bale for some reason, doesn't really make sense why. Joseph Gordon-Levitt knows Bruce Wayne is Batman because I don't know why.
Bruce Wayne? Billionaire orphan? When I saw you, I knew who you really were. I'd seen that look on your face before. It's the same one I taught myself.
What? There's literally a random twist villain near the end of the movie, and it's just laughably stupid. It feels like this dialogue that ranges from fine to laughably hilarious.
So you came back to die with your city?
No. I came back to stop you.
But all the lines are said by A-list actors that are trying their best not to make it sound that dumb. Sometimes they pull it off, and sometimes it's really obvious that these lines don't make much sense. I mean, Miss Hot Lady from Inception isn't very good. I want to acknowledge that she didn't give a great performance in Inception, but it works since most of her character is part of a dream anyway, so it's supposed to feel exaggerated. Her performance here does not work in this overly serious world, so no thanks. I mean, the movie's entertaining, and I wasn't exactly bored during any scenes, but the script was way too convoluted that it really bothered me after a while. This movie just feel like it was exploding with too many storylines and too many characters. I understand that Nolan just wanted to get back to working on Interstellar and wanted to get this $250 million blockbuster out to theaters by a deadline, so he barely put any thought into anything and the fans fell for it. But without all that hype surrounding it, I can gladly say that this is one of his worst movies. Do I have anything good to say about it? Well, I mean, Nolan shows off how much he's really mastered the craft with this really audacious filmmaking going on. Catwoman was great, and Anne Hathaway was incredibly likable as this character. I mean, we have no idea who she is, and she never gets a chance to be fleshed out, but you know, I still liked her. Tom Hardy as Bane was really goofy and brought a lot of comic booky spirit to the film, but his sound mixing was like, huh? I thought this was a really fun time, but has little to dissect, unlike the brilliant Dark Knight that came before it. As a conclusion to this overall trilogy, I think it gives a solid enough ending. I think it works fairly well, but like as a coherent film, it's a mess, and it feels like a million things happening at once, and nothing really sticks with you after sitting with it. Nobody ever talks about Insomnia, and I think there are a few things to acknowledge before I move on talking about why this is so low. Al Pacino gives a great and extremely tired performance in this thing, and really makes you feel uneasy and uncomfortable and puts you in the situation with this character. Robin Williams gives one of his most friggin' underrated performances that nobody ever talks about. He literally plays a villain that's a reflection of our hero. Like, why don't we ever talk about this? There are some genuinely intense moments. The cinematography, while not anything that special, gets the job done, and I think the plot is good and interesting. It's a good plot for a thriller. Okay, that's about it. I think Insomnia is one of Nolan's more underrated films, but I wish it was one of his best. I wish I could prove all the naysayers wrong and say, this is actually a great film, but it's not. Walking into this, I heard a lot of people talking about how this was some forgotten masterpiece, but I personally never really saw why once the credits started rolling. Now, I do want to acknowledge that this is a remake of the 1997 Swedish film of the same name, so if you want to get mad at me because I criticize some of the screenplay elements, just know that I know this is not an original story. I guess my biggest issue with Insomnia is that it doesn't really have much to say in the end to leave you with something special. It feels like an above average crime thriller with an interesting enough premise, but it doesn't seem to do much outside of that for me. Maybe I'm missing something, but there just doesn't seem to be some big central theme to really tie the whole experience together. Also, this movie is designed to make you feel really tired. Like, the score is really woozy and disturbing and calming all at once. In a lot of ways, that's good to give you that sense of disorientation to really get you in the mind of our lead character, but at a point it left me feeling drowsy in all the wrong ways. I just felt so disconnected from the story at a certain point in the film, and that just comes from the execution. This doesn't really feel like Nolan at all. Feels like him trying to prove to a studio that he can direct a big movie with an A-list cast, and I appreciate that for nudging him in the right direction for making popular films that actually have real intelligence put behind them, but it doesn't mean I'm going to automatically like this thing and think this thing is great. I don't hate it, and I enjoyed myself for a pretty decent chunk of the runtime, but I don't really feel a need to rewatch it, and I don't think it's one of his best movies. Tenet is really dumb. It's one of those that the more you sit with it and think about it, the more you realize this is just Nolan making spectacle a priority over substance. This is what I've always been afraid of with Nolan's work. At a point, most filmmakers working within big set pieces, big budget films, are going to forget their roots and what made them great in the first place. It happened a lot with David Lean back in the 70s and 80s when he relied on making films feel a lot more epic rather than emotionally enriching. It's been happening with Spielberg, my favorite filmmaker recently as well, with films like Ready Player One. Nolan is a great filmmaker and he tries to abolish plot holes and making films that are unlike anything we normally see by taking unique ideas and using his strength of creating visually pleasing shots to elevate every single scene. But each film he makes, you can see that he relies just a little too heavily on visuals over story and character. I mean, go watch Memento. That movie clearly shows where Nolan worked best at. With all that said, I think Tenet is everything I love and everything I hate about Nolan put into one film. I mean, visually, this thing is beautiful to look at. I mean, the action sequences are so well helmed and exciting, but then you come to the actual screenplay and you realize this doesn't really make any sense at all. And it's not really in the development of the concept of time reversal, because that stuff is pretty straightforward. It's the character motivations and the actual narrative structure that just make absolutely no sense to me. Like near the end of the movie, one of our main characters just shoots another random character out of nowhere, and it feels so out of place, and they never really explain why this character did that. I mean, what? I also really hate how Nolan decided to mix the sound for this thing, and that may contribute to why this film is so confusing. Like, I couldn't understand what anyone was saying for 50% of the movie. It just seemed like Nolan was purposely trying to tease the audience by adding an obstacle in our way so we couldn't make out what our main characters were saying. Like, what is this conveying? This is not a stylistic choice, so it shouldn't come with the film. What are you accomplishing by making the sound louder than everything else in the movie? It's so pointless to me. I think the performances are good. You know, our three main leads are really likable, but not that emotionally investing. I think Kenneth Branagh as the villain is really goofy and kind of feels like a James Bond villain, which is clearly what this film is trying to be. It's trying to be a James Bond movie. It's just overall a film that I can find enjoyment out of from a visual standpoint, but not much else. It feels like Nolan, the parody movie made for a $205 million budget, than just a good Nolan movie. Hopefully that makes sense. I think Tenet isn't bad. It's a movie that, it's okay. It's a good movie. Like, I enjoy it. I think it's entertaining. I think it's fun, but it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot by the end. What I love so much about Dunkirk is how Nolan decided to recognize the main thing he gets a lot of hate for, his characterization. Characters he writes for his movies feel so distant from the audience sometimes and aren't very easy to connect with. Think about it, Cobb, Coop, Bruce, Leonard. These are all characters played by brilliant actors, but aren't the most interesting characters to follow. They're not bad characters, but since Nolan writes his characters to be very overly serious, it doesn't really make them that interesting, and they could be so much more engaging to watch. It's the rest of how Nolan writes his films that make it extra intriguing and it can make me forgive those character issues. This all comes from writing, and I think Nolan just doesn't know how to authenticize movie characters to mold them into feeling like real actual human beings. What Dunkirk perfects is he just throws the entire idea out the window. Dunkirk is, in one word, immersive. It's supposed to be a big spectacle. It's supposed to be an experience. The movie decides to let the visual language of film take over. In a lot of ways, this shouldn't work because visuals don't make a movie, but Nolan somehow did it. While I don't love Dunkirk overall as a film, and I have a hard time really fully getting into it, and that's not a character problem, that's just me and my dumb personal taste, I respect what he was doing here. He realized that character writing really isn't his strong suit, so he decided to take a different approach to the story. I mean, the film he did right before this was Interstellar, and that was his most character-oriented story, and a lot of the film's criticism comes from the writing of the characters in that movie. Dunkirk doesn't utilize very much dialogue. It uses the beauty of the medium of film to communicate different ideas and themes while using that same medium to engulf us into this massive environment. It makes you feel like you're in the war without trying to do the whole one-shot thing that 1917 did, or make make it extra bloody to give it that R rating. No, this movie focuses on the experience of being in the war. There's no time for the characters to sit around and talk about how they have a wife and daughter back home and they need to make it back so all of us in the audience could be like, aha, so that's the guy that's gonna die. It respects the soldiers in this battle enough by giving them individual personalities communicated mostly through good actors and beautiful direction. It's not conveyed through dialogue, it's conveyed through film. I praised it a lot, but it's just not a movie I can see calling a favorite due to a lot of me just not really connecting with some of the individual stories. That's my personal opinion. This one I don't see myself rewatching very often unless I'm really in the mood for it, but it's still a pretty refreshing war film, all executed by one of our most ambitious directors working today. Also, this is probably Nolan's best film visually. Like, I mean, look at the cinematography, just look at it. Alright guys, here's where I actually get controversial. I don't really love Interstellar. I like it, but I don't love it. For some reason, the first time I watched this film was when I was about 13 years old, and I was watching with my family during a rainstorm inside, and we were at a family member's place, and there wasn't a TV in use for us, so we just watched it on a small laptop, and 7 people were all piled on top of each other to watch it. It was very uncomfortable and not very pleasant to sit through. I mostly blamed my viewing experience on how I actually felt about the movie. So when I went to rewatch it for this video a few months ago, I turned off all of the lights around me, watched it on my big boy TV with the sound turned all the way up, and I was ready to be blown away by this visual experience. And I felt pretty much the same way I felt back in 2017. Yeah, it was pretty disappointing. I do want to acknowledge that this is definitely one of his most ambitious films. This is maybe his best use of CGI in his movies. I mean, these effects are gonna be timeless. I cannot imagine watching this movie 100 years from now and thinking the visuals look bad. It's incredibly well made and well orchestrated. My problem here is the writing. I couldn't stand some of the monologues in this thing. It's just so blatantly obvious what Nolan was trying to say, but he didn't give it any subtlety and it came off as pretty laughable rather than genuine. Like, I know Chris's heart was in the right place and this feels like his passion project, but I feel like he was trying a little too hard to capture what it's like to be a human. But like I said with Dunkirk, he just can't write characters that feel like someone I'd really want to hang out with. The actors delivering these lines aren't bad actors at all. These are all really big names. It's the weird writing and the random monologues that come out of nowhere that really throw me off personally. Like at the end, Coop was talking about how love is the key to the universe, and it was just way too obvious. The supposedly profound character-driven sci-fi epic delivered its main message like the movie Frozen did.
Love. Of course. Elsa? Love.
This frustrates me because this film should really be my thing. I should love a movie that doesn't give all of its focus to the brilliant visuals and instead wants to make it more personal and character focused. Like, obviously I got a little teary-eyed during the scene where he's watching the messages from his kids. That was brilliant. That's a given. But the scene where he's driving away from home and his kid is crying, wanting him to come back, and he's like in tears and he's like driving away, like I just didn't feel that for some reason. I'm just really frustrated because this is a movie I wish I connected with, but the messages are just way too apparent that I couldn't take it seriously. I also don't really love the pacing very much. There's a random section of the film where they meet up with Matt Damon and it feels like it goes on forever. For a film that's supposed to be so epic with all these locations and set pieces, it just stays on this one boring planet forever, and I'm like, can we go? Please? It felt way too inconsistent for me to get really invested, unfortunately. The ending, while very disappointing for me personally, is handled well enough, and it doesn't go on for too long, and I like that. The score from Hans Zimmer is one of his top 5 best, next to The Dark Knight and The Lion King. The movie just shouts to me, but it's never really one I've connected with, and that makes me kind of sad. There are a lot of redeeming qualities to it, and again, I still really like a lot of aspects of it. It's still at number 6, so I still like it. I just don't love it. Yeah, I know I just pissed a lot of people off with this one. I know a lot of folks out there don't like this movie. I know a lot of people have recently discovered that Batman Begins is kinda whatever, and maybe it's even a really bad film. For me personally, I had a blast with it and I never took it too seriously. You're probably thinking, how could you put Batman Begins, that silly, stupid comic book movie, over that masterpiece Interstellar? I think those films are easily better directed and more slickly presented, but this is just something I needed for a fun time. For some reason, I thought I'd be bored out of my mind watching watching this, but I thought it really kept its momentum going. This is obviously not even close to touching the masterpiece that is The Dark Knight, and I will be talking about that soon, but this did feel the most like a Batman film than a great movie with Batman as the main character. The Dark Knight is amazing, and it's a fantastic crime epic with this awesome character as our lead, but Batman Begins explores his origins in a way that feels more like the comic book character. I don't read comic books, but from what I've seen from the Batman comics, this just seems like the character. It's got that dark, gloomy look to Gotham, giving it a nice brown and orange aesthetic. It introduces us to characters we know and love. I should probably get my problems out of the way first. I don't really like Katie Holmes as Rachel. At this point in time, it's pretty clear that Nolan isn't very good at writing female characters. Also, I love Cillian Murphy so much as an actor, but he's kinda pointless in here. Liam Neeson as Ra's al Ghul was pretty lit, and I liked him, but he kinda just shows up in the third act out of nowhere, and it feels pretty jarring. Alright, now let's get to the good stuff. Bruce Wayne. I love Bruce's character in this thing. This feels like the only film from the trilogy that really attempts to flesh out Bruce's personality and motivations very well. I love how he executes this already well-written character, and Bale is just such a blast to watch on screen. Now, for Nolan's direction specifically, I think this is one of his weaker projects. He never really did big action sequences prior to this film, so it felt like him trying to figure out how to film a fight scene, and whenever those come, you cannot tell where the heck anyone is. There's no point of reference in the scenes, so it all feels disorienting and confusing. Whenever it's just people talking though, it's fine. Batman Begins is a lot of fun. It dissects Bruce Wayne, has fun with its premise, it feels like a comic book movie, cool and slick. It's probably my favorite comic book origin story movie out there, despite having a pretty weak setup. It's got Nolan's name written all over it, and that's cool. Okay, now we're in favorites territory. This is Nolan at his most raw and basic, but also some of his most masterful and creative. You can tell that this is what he wanted following to be. Memento is everything following could have been if it had a bigger budget and better actors. I love pretty much every aspect of this film. It takes a pretty straightforward concept and gives it that little twist or little gimmick those haters want to call it. For those who haven't seen the film, our main character has short-term memory loss after trying to attack his wife's killer, so the whole film is designed to make you feel like you're being introduced to new information with each progressing scene. The way the film does this is by switching up the order of the scenes and playing them in a non-linear way. Most of the movie is played backwards. It moves back and forth between a black and white segment that's moving forward in time and a colored segment that's being played backwards. I mean, come on, this is one of the most originally structured films ever made, or at least in recent memory. I don't watch many foreign films, so don't quote me on that. This keeps the film so much more engaging and intriguing because you always feel like you're one step behind. You're constantly trying to catch up, and while yes, this is confusing, it also never lets up and is giving you that invitation to try to piece it together in your mind. I love movies that are basically just puzzles, and this is a clear example of that. You know that something's wrong and you're always trying to figure out what's lurking underneath the surface. It's such a brilliant concept and it really put Nolan on the map as one of those directors to look out for. For those that liked Following and haven't seen Memento, for some reason, watch Memento and you'll like it so much more. While this isn't the most emotional story Nolan has crafted, it's overall pretty cold-hearted. It makes that up in mysterious characters and overall great execution of this story. It's so well constructed and I cannot imagine making this thing. This is an all-time favorite for sure, and I'm excited to revisit it. This is a movie that I thought was overhyped for years. I didn't think this was one of the best comic book movies ever made, and I thought it was overly complex and kinda boring, honestly. Now, after rewatching it recently, I realized that this movie freaking rules. The Dark Knight is by far the best comic book movie ever made. It's also one of the best sequels ever made, and does what all great sequels do. It uses the world already established in the first film and builds upon it even more. It makes the city of Gotham feel so much bigger than it already is. It takes the already well-established characters and builds upon them even more while introducing new characters that add a lot of weight to the story and feel like they serve a purpose. Harvey Dent is a really underrated character, and y'all gotta show some respect for his character arc in this thing. It's amazing. Really something to behold. The whole movie just feels bigger and more epic, not just in atmosphere and action, but in character, theme, and emotion. You know, the basic stuff. Obviously, we have the best of all time performance from Heath Ledger, may he rest in peace, which will be forever one of the best performances inside a comic book movie ever. Feels like there wasn't that creative constraint that Nolan usually has with most of his characters. Honestly, the direction Nolan brought to this film is the reason I love David Fincher so much. It's smooth and direct and never feels too shaky or confusing. It's an inviting movie from a filmmaking lens that makes you feel like you could just step into the frame. It's just perfection to me, and I love it. This just feels like this guy at his A game. He's making a movie that has this constant progression and increasing momentum. The score from Hans Zimmer definitely helps carry the film, but I have to give so much credit to Nolan on this one for really bringing this world to life and making you feel the weight of every situation on screen. Yeah, similar to Dark Knight, I thought this was overrated for quite some time. Thankfully, I was pretty wrong because this movie, once again, rules. It's probably the movie that feels the most Christopher Nolan out of any Christopher Nolan film. It just has his name written all over every single scene. Such a brilliant concept executed so well. You could go on all day about plot holes or things that just don't make that much sense, but it's pretty minimal, to be honest. You can tell this man really cared about making this thing, and it feels like his brain just coming to life. It's such an entertaining piece of filmmaking that works so well. Now, I know I've been criticizing a lot of Nolan's characterization with his films quite a bit in this video, and yeah, Cobb isn't the most interesting person to follow, but he moves the plot along and makes the overall experience worthwhile, and it makes sense since the movie is basically a replication of the filmmaking process for Nolan. Cobb is trying to complete a mission which he needs many people involved with the execution of this process to get back to his kids, because Chris was trying to get back to his family since he was gone for so long making it. It makes the watch a little more heartwarming, and even though Cobb's character suggests otherwise, I mean, this guy has no friends. The film utilizes visuals in a really creative way that just brings the whole thing to life. It probably has some of the best blend of CGI and practical effects I've ever seen, and after 10 years holds up pretty much flawlessly. I cannot imagine anyone else directing Inception other than Christopher Nolan, and I cannot imagine Inception existing without Christopher Nolan. If you're disappointed, I guess I can see where you're coming from, but I think The Prestige is Nolan's best film easily. This movie just knows what it's doing, and no joke, I think it's near perfect. I don't say that about many films, but The Prestige is definitely one of them. From the way it's structured to the magic of it all, it's just an absolutely brilliant mystery film that I'll never get tired of. This film feels like Nolan at his most humble. He never overdoes it or gets too flashy with the camera or the edit. He takes a more subtle approach to the story while also making it as captivating as possible. I love how the film is about magicians and magic and stuff, and that the film is presented like a magic trick. The very first scene of the movie introduces you to the 3-act structure of a magic trick, and the film plays out in the same way. It's just brilliant stuff. I cannot imagine writing something like this, having to place specific scenes in certain places perfectly so the timing is just right for the audience to slowly discover the truth of what's really going on. Like, editing this and putting the whole thing together must have been a chore and must have taken so long. The movie also contains one of my all-time favorite movie twists, if not my favorite movie twist. Nolan purposely manipulates you to make you think harder about what you're watching on a deeper level, and that's just such joy to revisit. Most of what Christopher Nolan does is he likes to craft his films to play with time in a specific way that makes you want to see it again. Most of Nolan's work that I saw for the very first time, I didn't really have an urge to rewatch it over and over again. As soon as The Prestige ended, I wanted to rewatch it again. It's one of those films that you love to pick apart and understand on a more intellectual level, and it's just so fun. It's so entertaining to just watch these guys go at each other for the whole film, and these two leads really carried the movie all the way to the end. They find really unique and interesting ways to present different magic tricks and twists and turns and things they'll do to each other just to get what they want. Now remember, I said this like 20 million different times in this video about how Nolan characterizes. Well, guess what? Prestige is the best example of good characterization with his films. What I love is that these main characters are just so purposely unlikable. Why this works is since Nolan usually makes his protagonists overly serious, this movie doesn't, because we're not really supposed to root for these guys. He's not asking you to. He's just asking you to go along for the ride, and he gives us that invitation to go along wrong with it through his really awesome script and really refreshing direction. When he makes his protagonist really overly serious, it's not that fun, but when he makes his like main characters the bad guys essentially, and they're kind of jerks from the beginning, it just feels like him embracing that side. This is just one of those movies I can never see aging or feeling dated. It's his most underrated film, no doubt, and it's got some of the best performances within any of his work. It's just a masterpiece. I don't care. It's a masterpiece, and I don't say that about many movies. It's Nolan's best film. For those that hate it, I'm sorry you feel that way. This is just an absolute blast with one of the best third acts in recent memory. I love this movie to death, and yes, it's my favorite Nolan film. It's coming up at number 1. Yeah. So yeah, that's my Nolan ranking. I did it. Thank you so much, as always, for watching, and I guess I don't know how to finish this video, so I guess this is Ethan Butler, and I'm out.